Hi, my name is Alfredo Silva. I go by Fredo. I am a partner at Morrison and Foerster's Emerging Companies and Venture Capital practice in our San Francisco office. And I focus on companies in a variety of industries, including fintech, ag tech, and food tech, as well as general life sciences. So, doing all that work, I tend to have a lot of experience working with companies that are in regulated industries, even though I myself am not a regulatory lawyer. And for that reason, I'm going to be talking to you today about navigating compliance in a regulated industry as a regulated business while still managing your legal budget, because that's really important for early stage startups that don't have a lot of money to spend on lawyers. So before talking about how to manage your legal spend and managing compliance generally in a regulated industry, I think it's important to talk about what applies to all companies, whether you're regulated or not, right? And so there's going to be some laws that basically apply to everybody. Corporate law, which your corporate counsel like me or any other corporate lawyer can do, record keeping, minutes, qualifications to do business, et cetera. Tax, which actually attorneys don't usually do, that's going to be your accountants, making sure you have those. Employment and labor laws, right, and benefits laws. That's going to be something that a lot of companies use, outsourced firms like Gusto or HR consultants to deal with. But it's really important to make sure that you're complying with, labor laws and 401k rules, et cetera. And that's a pretty highly specialized area that a lot of people do use those kinds of consultants for. Then there's going to be privacy and data security. And for a while, that used to be something that was really applicable to certain businesses, but now pretty much everybody is covered by privacy and data security rules, whether it's the CCPA in California or GDPR in Europe or the rules in Texas or Massachusetts or Colorado. A lot of states are coming out with rules, and they're going to apply to anybody that's collecting data, user data, whether it's customer data or employee data. And unfortunately, a lot of ways that startups comply with this or try to comply with this is just copying the privacy policy off of some other company's website. But that is about the worst way to try to deal with privacy and data security that you could do, because one of the issues is that those policies are very well tailored to match that particular business and the legal regimes that apply to them, and even including language in there referencing laws that don't apply to you may suddenly make those laws apply to you just because you had it in there. And if you talk about complying in a certain way that doesn't actually match your business practices, you could be in violation of your own policy. And violating a policy in some ways is worse than having no policy at all. So just be very careful about that and definitely talk with your corporate counsel. I think one last thing that applies to a lot of companies that they don't even realize is OFAC screening. So in the United States, we have rules about not doing business with sanctioned parties. And anytime you're dealing with a customer and screening them in and taking them on the intake, there's a little bit of know your customer that you should do that involves screening off of the US SDN list. And it's the SDN list. It's Googleable. Just look it up and just make sure you're doing that, because at a baseline, when you're going through a diligence review down the road, it's a nice thing to be able to say, yeah, we checked the OFAC SDN list and make sure that we're not dealing with any sanctioned parties. It's an easy thing to do. Just add it to your compliance process for your know your customer onboarding. So I think the second category is rules that don't apply, because there's a whole lot of laws out there, right? And that would be stuff like, I don't know, zoning issues around like where you work. And like, probably everyone that's working from home, not everybody, but a lot of people might be technically violating zoning laws about that. But like, no one really cares that much or is paying that much attention. That's not what those laws are trying to get after. I think maybe also like certain types of random operating permits that a city may have, like they're not really going after every type of business so much as, storefronts. And so what I would say is there's an element of laws that's like material noncompliance, like immaterial noncompliance, where you can't really know everything about the law. No, but none of you guys probably went to law school. I did, and I still don't know about every law that applies to every company. And so it's a matter of thinking about like what's actually material, what's going to make a difference, what are we talking about when we're talking about laws that apply. So that's what I'm going to get to for the next stage of this conversation. All right. What is a regulated business? When we talk about regulated businesses, what we're really talking about are companies that are regulated by the FDA, because they are making food or drugs that are going to be, sold to people and consumed by people. The EPA, perhaps because they're making pesticides or biopesticides or otherwise, impacting the environment, and making sure that the products that they're issuing out there are going to be safe for the field workers, not toxic to bees, what have you. Export controls, because you are in a high-tech industry that, say, for example, is exporting semiconductors, and there are limitations on what kinds of semis and the IP underlying them can be made available to, say, Chinese companies or other companies. There might be the practice of medicine rules that might apply for a healthcare or health tech company, right, where only licensed physicians in some states are allowed to provide medical advice. And if you're a health tech company, that may not actually work. or financial services regulations, banking regulations, money transmitter laws, anti-money laundering. That might apply a lot to fintech companies and other companies in the financial services space. So how do you comply with all of these regulations that may apply to your business when you're not necessarily an expert? Even your corporate counsel, someone like me, isn't a regulatory expert. And there's a couple ways to deal with this. First, keep in mind that it's not actually always lawyers that are providing the advice here. A lot of times it's consultants that are providing that advice, and they can do so at specialized rates that are somewhat lower than your normal corporate counsel can do. And it's even possible to split up the work that you do at a big law firm that's handling your corporate and finance work and even your IP work versus a smaller firm that might be handling the specialized regulatory work. And that can be a major cost saving. Granted, firms like MoFo, we actually do have a lot of these regulatory practices. And for some startups, when they get to a certain stage, it may make sense for them to graduate to us, but not everyone. I think the second point is to keep in mind that you can get high-level advice at the get-go. Even a half-hour, hour or two conversation is better than nothing and sort of skipping it entirely and waiting till later. And so what I would say about that is like, look, it's okay for startups to try to move fast and break things, but at least know what you're breaking more or less and whether you can kind of fix it. And that high-level advice can be really helpful, right? Like there's a big difference between zero advice and like the perfect advice, and getting that is important. Which kind of dovetails, I think, into the next idea is the 80-20 rule, right? A lot of times you can get 80% of what you need to know for 20% of the cost. And so going out and doing that and then, waiting until later on to try to get the perfect advice makes a lot of sense, right? It's almost a concept of phasing, right? A lot of industries operate where like you're going to be able to use some amount of money from your investors to get to one point, like the MVP, and then with some more money from new investors after proving out the MVP, you'll be able to get to a different phase, right? And it might be a matter of getting some advice to make sure that the business model is viable for that phase one, and then developing the advice further for the phase two, once you have gotten additional equity that's able to sort of take you, to the next level. I think the last really big advantage that you can have in managing this spend is keeping in mind that there should be someone on your own team, one of your co-founders, or at least one or two advisors that are highly experienced in this regulated industry and understand the regulatory pathways, understand the obstacles, and can provide you the advice that you need. One of the biggest mistakes that I see is sort of founders that have come together, they have an idea based off of what they've sort of seen in the market as a consumer, but they don't actually have the experience in that market as a provider, whether having worked in-house at a bank or having worked at a hospital or having gotten a master's in public health or whatever. And so they don't really have any of the regulatory experience and are looking to the law firm to provide that in full. That can be incredibly costly relative to having someone on your team, or at least that's an advisor, that really understands the pathway. So I guess kind of it's like, go ahead and come up with the new ideas, be an entrepreneur, but try not to stay so far outside your lane that you don't actually know where you're driving. And then the last pitfall that I would mention in terms of managing your regulatory compliance is don't just assume that your corporate counsel is handling this all for you. A lot of times corporate counsel, they're handling, your equity, your stock plan, your financings, and they maybe know a little bit about IP, but unless you talk to them about handling your operational counseling for you, they probably aren't. And so that pitfall is basically like the gaps where you just haven't filled in the gaps by establishing that, this counsel's covering this part of my business, my other counsel's covering that part, making sure that they're coordinated and that everyone's clear on the same page as to who's covering what, so that you don't have gaps in falling through when it comes to compliance. Thanks, everyone, and look forward to maybe seeing you guys at the panel we'll be doing later this month.